Rock ideas from 1965 carry through all the way through the 70s. So for 15 years, there is this one genre which continues to evolve. They're not separated into late 60s, early 70s, late 70s. It's easy to discuss them that way, and that's why we're discussing it this way. But think of it as part one, part two, part three of one overarching idea. Early 70s can be thought of as the album cover for Dark Side of the Moon, with one beam of light hitting a glass pyramid, which then creates this prism of colors that shoots out the other side. Those are all these subgenres that emerge in the 1970s. Rock has become more consolidated. With that, unfortunately, comes more segregated as well, significantly less crossover between black and white audiences than we saw in the 1960s. The hippie aesthetic persists for now, but punk is going to push back against the hippie aesthetic just like disco did. Then new wave is going to do the same. So really we have disco and then punk and new wave, which we're going to say are two sides of the same coin in terms of a musical genre. And they're going to, by the end of the 70s, be really pushing back hard on this hippie aesthetic. When we say hippie aesthetic, just to remind you, we're talking about ideas like taking your music seriously, virtuosic solos, being really good at your instrument, self-contained band, using music technology to its fullest potential. These ideas are considered passé by this point. And if you think about it, people who were 18, 15 years before you were, did you like the same kind of music? And often the answer is no. Sometimes it's yes, but often the answer is no. And that's what's happening. This was almost their parents' music by this point. So people who were teenagers in the late 70s were rejecting this music from the mid 60s by the time that we get here. We see the rise of the big album, and that's going to be one of the ideas that we hit pretty hard today. The music industry is just completely taken aback by the astronomical success and amount of money that's being made off of some of these records. No one ever thought it could be done in music. FM radio is further developed and becomes increasingly formatted and business-oriented. We see the rise of gigantic stadium shows, which produce tremendous profits. And when you think of gigantic stadium shows, you need to think of Led Zeppelin. Now, this is one of the other things that they're really known for, is their efforts in pioneering the big stadium show. This was something that they started doing. They really did have a great business sense. Now, the Beatles started to play stadium shows just because that's how many fans wanted to see them perform, but Led Zeppelin were the ones who changed it into a business decision. So by the end of the 1970s, if you see a rock show, you're probably seeing it with 10, 20, maybe 30,000 other people. Because there's so much money to be made in these large stadium shows, a music industry, a sub-industry starts to emerge from this. Professional light companies, professional sound companies, professional guitar techs, moving truck companies, companies that build the equipment for the stage shows. This becomes its own industry. And actually, that's what my father did for a long time. He was a professional sound man for big groups such as Shania Twain and Garth Brooks. He would run the sound, and that was a full-time job running sound for these groups. And this is something that started in the late 70s. Some people will argue that by the late 70s, rock has sold out. There's this cynical idea that these records are just designed to make money, and this idea sometimes is called corporate rock. And if this is really going on, how can we say that this is a continuation of the hippie aesthetic? Is it rejecting those ideas, or is it a product of those ideas? There's not going to be a clear-cut answer, but it's going to be a topic that I think will be important to think about. So as we get to that point, I will encourage you to make up your own mind about whether by the end of this we have this idea of corporate rock, where it's all about the money, or if the hippie aesthetic truly is still carrying on with some of these bands. Now by this point, a little bit in the early 1970s, but really by the late 1970s, we're discussing these bands that we all think of today as being classic rock. Now, the term classic rock wasn't used. That's anachronistic to talk about it as classic rock now, but it will come to be known as classic rock in coming decades. So before we get into the biggest acts of the 1970s, we have to talk about one of the biggest acts in rock and roll in general and check in with what's been going on, and that is Elvis Presley. So, following his expired contract in 1968 with Colonel Tom Parker, who he had worked with since very early in his career, Elvis continues to record and release hit songs. It's now been 20 years, more than 20 years, since That's Alright Mama came out. A few fun facts along the way. In 1970, President Richard Nixon makes Elvis a federal agent, yes, a federal agent, with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. So this is like the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency today. Is he actually in the field kicking doors down? No, but he is technically a federal agent. He basically just asked the president to make him one, and Richard Nixon does. On January 14th, 1973, Elvis does a live concert, which is sent out across the country, called Aloha from Hawaii via satellites. This is the beginning of satellite television, really taking advantage of that. When you go to Las Vegas or New York and you see an Elvis impersonator with like a white jumpsuit and a really big pompadour hairstyle with sideburns down to the bottom of his cheeks almost, and big aviators, and it's almost a caricature of Elvis, this is the Elvis that they're talking about. You may have been thinking up to this point, this doesn't look like Elvis. This is not the person who I see people making fun of. Well, by the 1970s, you finally get that Elvis. So, following that concert, which was a huge success for him, he begins to be increasingly dependent on drugs and alcohol, specifically prescription drugs. Now, the following thing I want to tell you is not necessarily, I would say not even likely tied to that, but sadly, on April 16th, 1977, Elvis Presley dies of a violent heart attack. Some people claim that this was anaphylactic shock, heavily implicated by the prescription drugs. However, recent autopsies suggest that, or rather recent reviews of the autopsies suggest that that's not true. It makes for great headlines, but it really does seem to be just a horrible heart attack. And he was only 42 years old. He has a memorial at Graceland, which is just a very short drive outside of Memphis, Tennessee, just south of Memphis, Tennessee. President Jimmy Carter speaks about his death, saying that Elvis permanently changed the face of American popular culture, and 80,000 people lined the processional to the cemetery. So it was a very sad end to Elvis's career, which started in the 50s. He was the king of rock and roll. He went off to war, came back, became almost more of a teen idol, continued to do that, became a movie star in the 1960s. In 1968, finally released from his contract, starts to finally release music that's more in keeping with what he wants to produce, and he does that through the 1970s. So now let's switch and focus on mainstream rock. So technically, this video lecture is part of a series called the 1970s, but we are going to cover 1975 to 1980 because a lot of these ideas kind of carry through 1981. So still talking about the 70s, but a few ideas do bleed over just a little bit. By this point, FM radio, which was pioneered in San Francisco during the psychedelic era, has now shifted to more of a profitable business model where they're in pursuit of money. And if you think about it, this has always been true of radio. Radio is a for-profit enterprise. They don't make money because you listen to songs. They don't make money because you go buy the records after hearing the song. They make their money through advertisers. And the more advertisers you have, the more money you make. The more listeners you have, the more you can charge the advertisers. So it's in the radio station's best interest to create the most likable, most listenable song so that a ton of people listen, and they listen for a long time, and you can charge a premium for these advertisers. So that's what starts to happen. Because the focus is on making money, DJs begin to have less and less influence over music selection, which was one of the most important aspects of the birth of FM radio. Instead, program directors and media consultants are brought in to say, what are people going to listen to the most and for the longest? So that's how these decisions are being made. You can start to see why this idea of corporate rock comes around. Now, it sounds negative, but it does turn rock into America's most popular genre for the next 40 years and beyond. So is it cynical? Is it money hungry? Is it greedy? It's all those things. Sure, they're trying to run a business, so I'm not saying we should judge them negatively for that. But the point is that good things do come out of it. We get classic rock out of this movement. Originally, radio songs were between, actually a lot of them were under 2 minutes. Then they were as long as 5 minutes in the late 60s. Now we've settled on the 3 to 3.5 minute range that we have in modern radio. So finally, in the late 1970s, that is where we finally get to this point. So now let's talk about mega albums. So when I say a mega album, I'm referring to an album that just sold an astronomical number of copies and made a ton of money. So the first one is by Peter Frampton, 1976, an album called Frampton Comes Alive, and it is a live album. Two songs in particular on that album are called Show Me the Way and Baby I Love Your Way. And both of those songs feature a talk box. So a talk box is a very specific type of guitar effect. The way it works is basically you have a pedal, you have a pedal that you plug your guitar into, and it has a little speaker driver in there. So it's like using a large amplifier, and there is some surgical tube. So imagine a very long, thin piece of plastic tubing, maybe in 3/4 of an inch, half-inch diameter, and it's hollowed out. And you actually put the other end in your mouth, and one end goes to this pedal. And as you play, the sound from the guitar travels through this tube. The sound waves travel through the tube into your mouth. And as you shape your mouth, the guitar sound comes out, but in the shape of the words you're saying. So you can really make it sound like the guitar is talking to you. You'll hear this on the beginning of Show Me the Way. You'll also hear it in the 1980s with songs such as You Give Love a Bad Name by Bon Jovi, also a talk box. The Eagles have one of the biggest hits of all time, 1976, called Hotel California. They've added two guitarists by this point. If you remember, when we were talking about the Eagles, we said that they had a very intentional change in their music. They decided they wanted to get away from the country rock a little bit and go more for mainstream rock, hard rock. So they add two rock guitarists, Joe Walsh and Don Felder. And they released the album Hotel California, and this has some of their biggest hits. Such as Hotel California, the song, Life in the Fast Lane, and The Long Run, which was the follow-up in 1979. So when you think of when you think of the Eagles as a 1970s rock band, remember, second half of the 1970s, very different band, and that's when you get this Hotel California era. Another group, one of the biggest albums of the 1970s, one of the best albums of the 1970s, is by a band called Fleetwood Mac. So Fleetwood Mac begins as a British blues band in the 1960s, founded by Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. Eventually they add some other members, such as Christine McVie, Stevie Nicks, and Lindsey Buckingham. In 1977, they released this album called Rumors. This is one of the biggest hits of the 1970s. It was #1 on the charts for 31 weeks. This is more than 6 months. It is the #1 album, and it has hits such as Dreams, Go Your Own Way, and Don't Stop. A fun tangent on that, I think, an interesting story, if nothing else, is a few years ago I was doing a research project where I was trying to figure out if there's a canon for classic rock, what songs be in it? Which songs belong in that canon? What are the most important songs, most enduring songs? At that point, I wasn't really familiar with Dreams. I had heard it before, and if someone were to play it for me, I'd say, oh yeah, it's that song. I know that song. But I don't think I could have come up with the name on my own. And certainly if someone were to say, the song Dreams, how does it go? I would have had no idea what they were talking about. But Dreams came up more than any other song. And the way I did this is I took a bunch of different classic rock radio stations and I printed out their entire playlist 24 hours a day for one whole week. And I just tallied all the songs and the songs that came up the most frequently. And Dreams was the #1 song that came up. So because of that, I really started to get into Fleetwood Mac more. I was looking up albums, the biggest albums of the 70s. I kept seeing Fleetwood Mac Rumors, and finally I said, okay, I'm just going to sit down and listen to this whole album, and it's incredible. I had heard many of the songs before, but listening to it after studying popular music and studying rock music pretty intensely, I gained this new appreciation for it. So even though you may have heard Fleetwood Mac, and even though you may have heard some of these songs, I really encourage you to, at some point, if you're exercising, or if you're driving, or if you're just going for a walk or hanging out, listen to the whole album all the way through. It's a great album. It's equally represented by men and women, so anyone can sing along with at least some of the songs. Let's talk about some continuities, some of the bands that were big hits in the 1960s, and let's just check in on them and see what they're doing in the 1970s. We'll start with the Rolling Stones. So, I've said this a few times during the 1960s unit, but the Rolling Stones are arguably bigger in the 70s than they were in the 60s. And a lot of music scholars attribute that to the Beatles breaking up, that all of a sudden there's a room for the Rolling Stones to be famous. It's not that they got better, they were always great, but no one can really compare with the Beatles. and finally the Rolling Stones can take their place as one of the best rock bands, as the best rock band by many people's opinion. Some of their albums to talk about: 1976, they have Black and Blue. 1978, they have an album called Some Girls with their song Beast of Burden, as well as Miss You, which we talked about in the disco era. 1980, they have Emotional Rescue. And the fact that they were only successful, arguably, this is just opinion, right? Arguably only successful because the Beatles broke up. There's one way you could argue against that. And that is that the Beatles, the individual members, were still releasing music. When we were talking about the psychedelic movement in the 1960s, I mentioned a group very briefly called the Steve Miller Band. So let's return to him now because he was more successful in the 70s than he was in the 60s. In 1973, he releases an album called The Joker with the hit single The Joker. Follows that up in 1976 with an album called Fly Like an Eagle with the three singles Fly Like an Eagle, Rockin' Me, and Take the Money and Run. We have a group called the Doobie Brothers, also from San Francisco, who, like the Eagles, had two very distinct periods in the 1970s. The first half, they had one sound. The second half, they had another sound. A few Doobie Brothers songs that I'd like you to take a listen to would be Listen to the Music, Long Train Runnin', and Blackwater. One of my favorite bands, and the band that really encouraged me to get into music, was Boston. So Boston is a band, that's their name, but they're also from Boston. They are led by guitarist and songwriter Tom Scholz, who actually had a degree in engineering from MIT, which is kind of right down the street from Harvard. It's one of the best schools in the country. And they had, for a very long time, I'll have to check up on this, but for years and years, decades, they had the most successful debut album of all time. This came out in 1976 and it was self-titled, so it was just called Boston. Many hit songs from this, such as More Than a Feeling, Peace of Mind, One Song, which has two names, there's a front half and a back half, it's almost like two movements, Foreplay, Long Time. This song is actually almost a prog song. It has a lot of classical elements, especially in the beginning, and then a song called Smokin', which also has many prog elements, this time in the middle. But what they're doing, it's a little different than progressive rock as it existed on its own in the early 70s, is they're doing a blend of progressive classical music with blues rock. So they're making it more approachable for mainstream audiences. Another band that had some classical prog elements was Foreigner with their songs Feels Like the First Time and Hot Blooded, and the song that really has a prog element, kind of a classical bridge, is Cold as Ice from 1977. Now, Foreigner is writing songs that are very much focused on sexual themes. So in that sense, you could say it was targeted to men. However, there was another band, a contemporary band from the same time period, which many music scholars argue is targeting women, which is Journey. So we've talked about Journey a few times. Many of the members from Journey were Carlos Santana's backing band in San Francisco. They left to start their own band. Carlos Santana, of course, replaced them. But this group of instrumentalists go on. They finally add the singer Steve Perry, and they release a few hits in the late 1970s. One is called Lights. The other is called Lovin' Touchin' Squeezin'. And if you listen to these songs, you can definitely, I think, hear what I'm talking about, and that they're trying to target female audiences more than male audiences. Listen to a song like Lovin' Touchin' Squeezin' and then listen to Hot Blooded, and which one is targeting men, which one's targeting women. So because these two bands seem to very intentionally be writing songs to target certain groups, is that an argument in favor of corporate rock? That this is all just a marketing ploy to make money? You'll have to decide that. We have Cheap Trick from a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. They have a few songs, a few records come out, but their big breakthrough is in 1979. They released an album called Cheap Trick at Budokan, which is a famous performance venue in Japan. And they recorded a live version of a song that was actually much earlier that they did called I Want You to Want Me. Cheap Trick went on to work with the Beatles producer George Martin. So you'll have to listen to some Cheap Trick and let me know if you hear some Beatles influence in there, if just working with the same producer is enough for that. Now we are finally at a band that I have been waiting so long to focus on, which is, not that it matters in a context like this kind of class, but probably one of my favorite bands ever. Certainly the band that made me interested in guitar and interested in music and interested in pursuing a career in music, and that is Van Halen. Van Halen was formed in Pasadena, California in 1974. It is made up of brothers Eddie Van Halen and Alex Van Halen, as well as singer David Lee Roth and Michael Anthony. In many ways, Van Halen represents a precursor to heavy metal that we'll start to see in the 80s, but absolutely, Eddie Van Halen is known as one of the most important guitarists for developing shred style of playing. So their first album is just called Van Halen from 1978, and the demo for that was produced by Gene Simmons of Kiss. He heard them playing, he said, "I want to pay for your demo album." He helped get them signed. Their first album has a ton of hits. In order on the album, we have Running with the Devil, Eruption, You Really Got Me, Ain't Talking About Love, and I'm the One. So let's talk about Eddie Van Halen for just a moment, because he is one of the most important individual figures in rock history. So many people say he's the second greatest guitar player of all time, after only Jimi Hendrix. Now, the fact of the matter, as far as I'm concerned, is Eddie Van Halen is actually a far better guitarist than Jimi Hendrix is. The difference is Jimi Hendrix was innovative in a way before Eddie Van Halen was. And sometimes people make the argument that there would be no Eddie Van Halen if there wasn't Jimi Hendrix a few years earlier. Maybe. However, this is what I want you to take away from this. In this time period, 1970s, going into 1980s, Eddie Van Halen is going to be regarded widely as the best guitarist, the greatest guitarist of all time. The 60s, it's Jimi Hendrix. The 70s on, it's Eddie Van Halen. He has a solo, a guitar solo, and I really would struggle to think of another band that did this, but they have a song on their first album. It's the second track. It's called Eruption. There is a moment in the very beginning where drums and bass play one note, and then maybe 30 seconds in, the bass and drums play 3 more notes. But other than that, the whole song is just 1 minute and 42 seconds of a guitar solo, an electric guitar solo. In this one song, in 1 minute and 42 seconds, Eddie Van Halen introduces a ton of new playing techniques that no one had ever heard before. So let's take a look at what some of those are. We're going to look at 3 main techniques of Eddie Van Halen. The first one actually isn't so much a technique as it is just playing notes that a lot of other guitar players were playing at the time, but playing them really quickly. So for example, some notes like these, or don't sound like much on their own, but you speed them up, and all of a sudden they take on a different feeling. The next one we're going to talk about is called speed picking or tremolo picking. So tremolo picking or speed picking, really, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're picking the guitar strings, but you're doing it really quick. And often this is done on just one string. So for example, I'm just going to play the high E string, but I'm going to pick it constantly. And then I'm going to change the notes here. And the last one is tapping. This is perhaps the most important one. So this is something that Eddie Van Halen never claimed to have invented, but he's certainly the person who made it popular for the mainstream. He was first inspired by Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, who would do something like this with one hand. And he would just pull off to open strings, and it's something that he could do live, so he could put one hand in the air to the crowd, and with the other hand just playing. Something like that, right? So Eddie Van Halen's idea was, rather than pulling off to the open string, what if I use a finger to change the notes? And then his idea was, okay, well, what if I switch this hand over here? And then you start alternating between 2 to 3 to sometimes even 4 notes. For example, so I'm using my right hand to play one note, and I'm using my left hand to play 2 different notes. So, recapping a few of the important ideas about Eddie Van Halen. Shred. He is the inventor or at least the person who introduced tapping to the mainstream America, a mainstream world. He's prominently using tremolo picking. His biggest influence was Eric Clapton, actually, of Cream, but Eric Clapton's biggest influence was Robert Johnson of the American South, a Delta blues musician. So you can really hear this amazing blues playing in Eddie's style, but Eddie's just playing it 10 times faster than anyone else had ever played it. Even Halen's playing, because he has these amazing blues aspects to his playing, if you slow it down, sometimes it's even better. He was a pioneer of building his own guitars. He took basically a Fender Stratocaster and a Gibson Les Paul, the two most important solid body electric guitars at the time, took the best elements of each and shoved them together and made his own guitar called the Frankenstein because of the manner in which he assembled it. He has a custom pedal board, and as you saw earlier, he invented a lot of new techniques, or at least some of them he invented, others he discovered on his own independent from other people, but he certainly was the first person to use them in a mainstream way. Let's see where prog has gone since the early 70s. So the band Genesis, Peter Gabriel left, replaced by drummer Phil Collins. In many ways, they're even more successful with Phil Collins than they were with Peter Gabriel. Groups like Boston and Foreigner are making prog radio friendly. And now with these next groups, rather than just taking classical and playing on rock instruments, they're going to blend classical, rock, and blues with pop all into one genre, which is very radio friendly, but also very interesting to listen to. The first one is Kansas, with songs like Carry On My Wayward Son and Dust in the Wind. We also have Styx with songs like Come Sail Away, Rush, a Canadian group, with songs like Tom Sawyer, Queen, fronted by singer Freddie Mercury and guitarist Brian May, their album Night at the Opera with songs like Bohemian Rhapsody and Killer Queen, and not only incorporating classical elements, but also opera elements, which you'll hear. All of the vocals on there, or almost all of the vocals, are Freddie Mercury. Sometimes you hear the other guys, but despite how it was portrayed in the film Bohemian Rhapsody, it's almost all Freddie that you hear, just layered and layered and layered. And that ties in with this idea of the hippie aesthetic, of using technology to its fullest potential. Following up on some singer-songwriters, Bob Dylan starts to release music again, like Tangled Up in Blue. Elton John is still going strong with songs like Don't Go Breaking My Heart. Paul Simon's still recording music. Billy Joel with his hits like Piano Man out of Long Island, New York. Jackson Browne, who co-wrote Take It Easy with the Eagles out of Los Angeles with his hits Running on Empty. Bob Seger, who we've talked about, no relation to Pete Seeger, the first wave of folk music with Woody Guthrie, that group, not related. So he's from Detroit, Michigan. You have songs like Turn the Page and Night Moves. Bruce Springsteen. Bruce Springsteen is one of these guys who's going to be far more successful in the 1980s, but in 1975 he does have the hit song Born to Run. So with these singer-songwriters and with prog as well, I want you to think about how prog and how singer-songwriters have been developing for the last 15 years by the time we get to the end of the 1970s, and have they taken out where they can to make it a stronger, better style? Has it been made lean and mean? Have they cut down? Or has it just been homogenized? The textbook even says, has it been neutered? So you have to ask those questions. Is this an improvement, or is this making it worse? It's an opinion, and it's your opinion, but I'd love to hear what you think on that. Now we're getting to the final big topic, which is punk music. And punk, as I mentioned before, believe it or not, has something very important in common with disco, and that's that both of them challenge the hippie aesthetic, but in pretty different ways. So let's begin by talking about US punk from 1967 to 1975. Music in this time period is all about confrontation, rejecting the status quo, both culturally and musically. So the first band that we'll look at is called the Velvet Underground. Their singer, Lou Reed, and Velvet Underground is actually initially working with Andy Warhol, who is known as a famous artist in the 1960s, famous for recontextualizing familiar pieces, like turning a Campbell's soup can into art, or turning photographs of Marilyn Monroe into art, separate from just the photographs that they were. So he's working with the Velvet Underground. They released this album called The Velvet Underground and Nico in 1967, and one of the songs on there is called Heroin. So heroin and the Velvet Underground at the time really didn't resonate with hippies. It was at the same time though similar to the Doors, because you remember the Doors approach is that it was about the darker side of psychedelia, the darker side of LSD and all these drugs. What happens when we explore that? So that's very similar to what the Velvet Underground was doing. So the Velvet Underground went on to inspire groups like Iggy Pop of the Stooges, and I don't know if this is a compliment or not. In fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't. But Iggy Pop said of Lou Reed, the singer for the Velvet Underground, that wow, that guy can't sing, but he has a successful music career. I can't sing. I can have a successful music career too. So again, not much of a compliment. But he was known for his wild stage antics, like he would smear peanut butter all over his body on stage and then run and jump in the crowd, things like that. At this time period, we also have a very important punk scene developing in New York City. Groups like the New York Dolls, who kind of are glam with this androgynous approach, sort of similar to David Bowie, but you're kind of taking the artistic and social commentary aspects out of it, and you're just dressing as girls for the shock value of it, mixed with the gritty city. We have dresses, makeup, the whole thing. They're known their songs, their lyrics are about these like kind of sexually driven and almost dark underworld vibe. They weren't very successful, but they did inspire a lot of other bands who would be very successful. One of the venues where they performed, and many of these other New York bands who performed, is called CBGB, extremely famous club in New York. It's in this part of the East Village called Alphabet City, where streets like Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, that's why it's called that. If you were walking around CBGBs in Alphabet City down a dark street corner in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s, you might get mugged. Even in the 90s, it was a really bad, dangerous, drug ridden part of town. It's recently been gentrified, so now it's really expensive and it costs a lot to move into this area, but it was a very seedy, dangerous part of New York City at the time when this was all going on. So CBGB stands for Country, Bluegrass, and Blues, even though that's not at all the kind of music they play. You can almost think of them as sort of like the Grand Ole Opry of punk, only in the sense, like not with the radio station, because that's part of why the Grand Ole Opry was so important. It was a radio station, but just the fact that the Grand Ole Opry is like the venue. If you're a country music artist, you want to perform at the Grand Ole Opry. If you're a punk artist, you want to perform at CBGB. We have another group called the Ramones. So they also didn't experience much success in the 1970s, and they were really only known in the punk community at the time. They had their debut album with the hit within their own community called Blitzkrieg Bop, but this is something that became famous later. When they were releasing music initially, it was a very small community that knew about them. The final group we'll talk about from this New York punk scene is called Blondie, fronted by vocalist Debbie Harry. Now, a lot of people see Debbie Harry and they think that her name is Blondie, and that's just the band's name, like Fergie or Beyonce or Madonna or something. That's not what's going on. The band is Blondie. Her name is Debbie Harry. She goes by Debbie. We're not going to talk about them too much now. We're going to talk about them when we get to New Wave, but they are fitting within the same model. Within punk fashion, you get an emphasis on doing it yourself, making your own clothing, wearing leather, wearing safety pins, wearing ripped jeans, denim, dyed hair, mohawks. I certainly went through a punk phase in high school where I had all this stuff on, and I had my lip pierced. I had the safety pin, lip piercing, things like that, which I thought was super cool. It's not. If you're thinking about it, don't. But it was fashionable. For the record, I was not in high school in the 1970s. I was not alive in the 1970s. Moving on, we have the UK punk scene. So we have 1974 to 1977. At this point, in the 1970s, this is true in the UK and in the United States, there is an economic recession. Money is tight for everyone, but it's actually worse in the UK than it was in America. And that contributes to the reason why the UK punk scene is just a little bit different than the United States punk scene. There's this thought by a lot of people of like, why bother? There's no hope. We're never going to get out of this. So keep that in mind as we listen to some of this music, because hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense if you keep that in mind. Keep in mind how much some of these people were truly struggling. We have a man named Malcolm McLaren, and Malcolm McLaren owned a clothing store which was initially titled Let It Rock, and they sold biker garb, so like biker clothing. And he saw the band New York Dolls in New York, and he wanted to manage them. He actually approached them, said, "I want to manage you guys," and they said, "Sure." He did become their manager, but before he began working with them, they were already on the verge of breaking up anyway. Half of them were alcoholics, the other half were drug addicts, and the drug addicts couldn't get along with the alcoholics. Their different substances that they were abusing made them act in certain ways where they just couldn't get along with each other. So the band broke up. Well, what Malcolm McLaren does is he decides to go back to his clothing store in London, and he's going to rename it Sex. And he begins selling fetish wear, like sex related clothing. And what he then does is says, you know what, I have this idea. This store is being really successful. People are attracted to it because it's this spectacle. It's something they're not supposed to want to see. And what he does is, because people are complaining about seeing this fetish wear in the window, he puts a piece of paper over the window and cuts a little hole in it. And if people are interested, they have to go put their eye up to the hole and see what he's selling. This gets almost a little crowd around him because people want to know what's in there. What's so bad that we can't see it? So this emphasis on sex and this emphasis on something that's bad, he decides to take his idea for managing a band and creates his own band called the Sex Pistols. Again, kind of like the Monkees, but not for TV. And in fact, it's a real band that plays real music, but it's assembled by Malcolm McLaren. So the Sex Pistols were led by frontman Johnny Rotten. Of course, that's a stage name. And they're famous for their scandalous and notorious punk behavior. They would use swear words on TV, things like that. They would disrespect everyone. In 1977, they had their album Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, and one of their hits was Anarchy in the UK. For her Jubilee year, Queen Elizabeth II had this barge that was going down the river, and the Sex Pistols rented a boat, and they were blasting their own music during this, and of course they got arrested. It was all over the news, but that's what they wanted. They wanted that spectacle. They wanted that idea, and for people to think of them as these delinquent, young people who were out causing trouble for the sake of it. Well, having a band that's that volatile can't last, and it didn't. So the band broke up shortly after that. They only ever released that one album, but they were successful. A lot of people actually liked that. You have another band around the same time called The Clash, and unlike the Sex Pistols, who were more about just bad delinquent behavior for the sake of it, the Clash questioned authority, but they were more in a political way. So the Clash were actually a little bit closer to like the folk revival or the hippies of the late 1960s. For an example of their music, listen to London Calling. So the UK punk scene was inspired by the New York punk scene from a few years earlier, and they learned from groups like the New York Dolls and the Ramones. But then these groups, the Sex Pistols and the Clash, are then going to further inspire punk music in the United States and in the UK. So it's just like the blues. Started in Mississippi and Chicago, went to the UK, became famous with groups like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, then came back to America. Well, this is the same thing happening with punk, only on a much faster scale. This whole thing happens within the course of a few years. So following this, we get the birth of a new genre. So this new genre is called New Wave, and it's the new wave, it's the new trend. That's where this name New Wave comes from. So now we're talking about American New Wave from 1977 to 1980. Record companies saw that the Sex Pistols and the Clash were successful, but they wanted to remove the danger and the controversy from the punk sound, just like record companies did in 1960 with rock and roll. They wanted to create this softer version with these teen idols like they did with groups like the Beach Boys. It's the exact same thing happening again, but this time rock and roll was turned into just this golden age of rock, or early 1960s pop. Now punk is being transformed into new wave, but stylistically they are very, very similar. It's really just the attitude that's a little bit different. And the Sex Pistols just weren't worth the trouble. They kept getting sued for things. It wasn't worth the legal hassle or the money. So the Sex Pistols never had a revived career. They couldn't be domesticated, is the way that that John Kovacs puts it. Now, this punk attitude is attractive to this new hippie generation, which we talked about before. It's 10 to 15 years after this birth of the hippie movement, and they're no longer interested in that. So, new wave is like punk light, and it's being targeted to these groups of people. Again, you want to talk about corporate rock. Again, this is being formulaically designed to be enjoyed by young people in the late 1970s. So, now let's return to Blondie, who we talked about earlier. Again, from New York, played at CBGB's, fronted by singer Debbie Harry, intentionally going for a Marilyn Monroe look. Marilyn Monroe, we talked about also. Um, Elton John wrote the song Can't Hold the Wind about her. She was a famous celebrity, movie star, sex symbol, Playboy model, all sorts of things in the 1960s. Allegedly had an affair with JFK, things like that. So she's intentionally trying to look like Marilyn Monroe when she performs. Two of Blondie's biggest songs are Call Me and Heart of Glass. We also have bands like the Talking Heads with their song Psycho Killer. Talking Heads were made of a bunch of guys who went to art school together, so they really understood irony, things like that. We have a band from Boston called The Cars with their hits Just What I Needed and My Best Friend's Girl. Tom Petty starts to emerge in the 1970s, and he's very heavily influenced by groups like the Byrds. He has some hits, American Girl, Don't Do Me Like That, and Refugee. Devo, fronted by two men whose stage names are Bob 1 and Bob 2. They're going for this futuristic feel, and they have a version of I Can't Get No Satisfaction that they perform as if they're robots. So we're getting a little weird. That's what we're going for at this point. But they also have an original song, which is a big hit called Whip It. We have a group called the B-52s with a song Rock Lobster. The B-52s are going to come back and be big hits 10 years later with Love Shack. But at this point, Rock Lobster is their big hit. And finally, a group called The Knack, which you probably wouldn't tell from their music, but they're trying to emulate the Beatles. If you see them perform, though, it becomes much more clear that they're going for a Beatles kind of feel. But anyway, My Sharona is their big hit. And My Sharona is one of those songs where if you start with the drums or the guitar, and you're playing this in a club or it's on the radio or a live band or something, they're probably like the whole crowd can probably sing along with the chorus. It's that level of fame. At least it was for a very long time. So that was American New Wave. Let's talk about British New Wave, same time period, 1977, 1980. We have a singer a singer named Elvis Costello, and he has a gig on Saturday Night Live. He has a performance scheduled. He's supposed to do this song called Less Than Zero, so he shows up and they do a practice run before the show starts filming, and the cameramen choreograph how they're going to film it, and that's how they always do it. Then the show comes, and they start Less Than Zero, but halfway through, or it's not even halfway through, like 40 seconds in maybe, Elvis Costello stops the band, turns around, and says, what are we doing this? There's no point in doing this. Let's do Radio Radio, this other song that they had recorded but not yet released. And the cameramen frantically try to readjust and capture the best they can. And Lorne Michaels, the producer for Saturday Night Live, comes up to him furious and says, "You'll never work in this town again." He's wrong. Elvis Costello becomes a big hit. The song on the playlist of Elvis Costello is Pump It Up. So a little bit of the punk attitude is still coming through, even though we've largely lost a lot of it. I would say the most important new wave group would be The Police, with singer Sting, drummer Stuart Copeland, and guitarist Andy Summers. Sting is the vocalist but also plays bass. So they're great because it's pop and it's new wave, so it's using punk, but it's also really incorporating jazz and reggae in a very cool way. They have some big hits with Roxanne and SOS. They're going to release another album, many albums, but an album in the 80s called Synchronicity, which is going to be a great album with a lot of big hits on it too. So if you want to think of an exemplary band for new wave music, my suggestion would be The Police. So new wave, and you can kind of see this not only from, Elvis Costello wears Buddy Holly style glasses, and Debbie Harry of Blondie tries to look like Marilyn Monroe on stage. What they're doing, these new wave performers, is they're trying to pay homage and honor to the music industry and the entertainment industry as it existed before the hippie aesthetic. So think of anything before Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The early 60s, the late 1950s, that's what they're going for, both, again, musically and visually. So as you're listening to this song, as you're watching some of these videos, look for those clues. Look for ways that they're trying to pay homage to this style. For example, the B-52s, they have like beehive hairdos, like in the early 60s. So Summarizing the 1970s, there is an arch that begins with the mid 60s and goes through psychedelia and goes through the early 70s and all the way to the late 70s that is dominated by the hippie aesthetic. Yes, we have styles like funk and Motown, which in the 60s we would have thought as being different, but they're starting to adopt these models as well. So even black pop at this point is incorporating the hippie aesthetic. That all gets challenged at the very end with disco and punk by the end of the 70s, and that will kind of set a new tone for the 80s. But again, think of that point, mid 60s to 70s are the evolution of one large genre. Some of the most important ideas of the hippie aesthetic are professionalism in music, taking your music seriously, being authentic, being a self-contained band, high levels of production, the use of new technology, this transformation from a craftsman to an artist, and being ambitious. So that is it. We have made it through the 1970s. There's a lot of music to listen to, but I hope you enjoy all of it. I will see you next time for the 1980s and the rise of MTV.